Carter. I had a chance to meet her a number of years ago when I was at the Goddard Space Flight Center, and that's where she has spent quite a bit of her time. But initially, her undergraduate degree was in sciences at the University of Illinois, and then she did a master's and a PhD at Cornell University in astronomy. After that, she did a postdoc at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and then began working as a research scientist at the Goddard Space Flight Center. And that's, for those of you that know it, it's a fantastic place. For those of you that don't, it really is an extraordinary place for space sciences research. It has almost 10,000 people that work there. It basically is involved in just about every space mission that takes place in the United States. Over the time that she was there working with NASA, she received a number of different awards, including a fellowship for early career researchers in planetary sciences, group achievement awards for SHARAD, which is a ground-penetrating radar for Mars, which you'll hear more about this evening, as well as an early career achievement medal. She's worked on a number of different spacecraft missions, SHARAD, which I mentioned, but also the mini-RF science instrument, which is a radar instrument for the moon, and has worked on a number of other Mars-related missions, including the RIMFAX radar, which is a ground-penetrating radar for the upcoming Mars 2020 rover, the REASON radar, which is for a very exciting flagship mission to the Jupiter system, and particularly to Europa. She also serves now as the deputy PI for the mini-RF instrument. This is that radar for the moon that I mentioned before on the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and is a co-investigator on a joint venture with an international partnership with Korea, an instrument called ShadowCam. So in addition to all these fantastic mission opportunities, she is a fantastic scientist that has worked on not only the Earth and Mars and Europa, as I mentioned, but the moon and also the very veiled planet of Venus, which is where a lot of her PhD work came from. So at this point, I'd like to be able to introduce our speaker. And again, if you have questions at the end, please don't hesitate to put up your hand. We'd like to be able to hear your questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you, Chris, for that very good introduction. I'm really happy to be here tonight to talk to you about radars and Mars climate and how we're using radars to look at the stratigraphy of Mars to understand the climate better. U of A is really famous for the HiRISE instrument on Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And that's the instrument that provides tons of beautiful pictures. There's some of them around the building, and many of you may have been to talks by Alfred McEwen and other people on the HiRISE team showing these gorgeous pictures, very high resolution. So I work on a different instrument on that same spacecraft mission. And it's a radar, not an optical image, so I'm really excited to talk to you about this different way of looking at the surface. I think it's a way that people don't often know about, and they haven't often spent a lot of time thinking about this instrument. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about it tonight. So Mars climate is the big reason that we send so many spacecraft to Mars. Looking back through Mars history, when we look at the old terrains on Mars, we can see evidence for these valley networks. And we think there was flowing water on the surface of Mars billions of years ago. Of course, when we see evidence of flowing water, everyone thinks there could have been life, or it could have been a habitable environment. Even as Mars got older and it lost a lot of its atmosphere, we still see evidence that there was a lot of running water on Mars. So there's these big outflow channels. So even moving to like 1 billion years ago, which is more recent in the Mars history, we still see evidence of liquid water occasionally on the surface of Mars, and occasionally a lot of water. Mars also has a lot of impact craters that have been filled in with water that could have provided lakes where organisms could have grown. The Curiosity rover currently now is at Jezero Crater, so they're doing a lot of chemical and mineralogical investigations to try and understand this environment, and they found evidence for long-lived water at Jezero Crater. And so our exploration of Mars has really been focused on looking at the areas where there are water and trying to understand things about how long could water have been present? Could it have been a habitable environment? Could things have evolved there? And how does Mars climate change over time from the very beginning of Mars, where the atmosphere was thicker and it was warmer and more clement, to the current day where Mars is very dry it's very cold, the atmosphere is very thin, and it's very hard to have running water on the surface of Mars today. So some of the questions we're interested in is, how does that evolution compare to that of Earth? Can we learn things from studying those really old terrains on Mars that would tell us things about how life could have gotten started on Earth? How long was Mars habitable? Was it really only habitable when you had this running water on the surface, 3 billion years ago or something? Or could there have been pockets of habitability where you might have had habitable environments that were only lasted for a very short period of time, but maybe if you had a biosphere early on, maybe then that could have sort of maintained itself over long periods of time. And so what processes could have contributed to that? So, for example, volcanism is one that we often talk about. Like if you have a lot of volcanism going on Mars, could that have created situations where you had liquid water that was very temporary? And what are the constraints on habitability for planets like Mars? So now we can go out, we can use telescopes, and we can find exoplanets of different sizes. And one of the big questions that people have about exoplanets is, how can you tell whether or not a planet that we find around another star is habitable? And so really understanding Earth and Mars and Venus in our solar system is how we've previously studied habitability. And so studying Mars and Venus are sort of two end cases that we can then take forward when we study extrasolar planets to try and understand whether what we find out elsewhere in the galaxy is a place that could be habitable or that could have been habitable for a while. So that's kind of the picture of why we're interested in Mars climate. And then from the standpoint of radar, there's a couple of reasons why I'm really interested in radars. So for geology, stratigraphy is really key to understanding things. I mean, that's how we understand the history of the Earth. So you can go to the Grand Canyon and you can see all those beautiful layers and look back through Earth's history and understand how the climate's changed, how organisms changed over time. And what we want to do on Mars is the same thing. So if you just use optical images, and these are some of the images from the HiRISE camera, you can see evidence for layering, like in crater walls. This is one of the polar ice caps of Mars, and you can see layering there. But the advantage of radar is that it's long wavelengths that can penetrate into the surface, and you can reveal buried structures. So you're not limited to just what you see on the surface. You can actually see into the subsurface. And then also radar is sensitive to the density and composition of materials, but in a different way than spectroscopy. And so sometimes with the radar, we can understand something about the composition of those materials that it's going through. So stratigraphy is really, I think, the main reason that we're interested in radars at Mars. So what is radar, especially compared to optical systems like the HiRISE camera that everyone's probably familiar with? Radar is light too, but it's at very long wavelengths. So it's radio wavelengths. So on the electromagnetic spectrum, we're talking about things that are down here, microwaves to radio waves, so not the visible light that we're all familiar with. And these long wavelengths, the advantage of them is that they can penetrate pretty far into the surface. And the depth of penetration depends on the wavelength. And so generally you can penetrate maybe about 10 times the wavelength into the surface. And so that gives you a rough idea. So if you want to penetrate farther into the surface, you want the longest wavelength radar possible. So this is sort of the realm that we're living in the radar space. And also, there are two types of radars. At least this is how I think about it. So some of you may be familiar with the shuttle radar pictures or orbital radar pictures. And this one right here is a space shuttle radar picture, this is the Sahara Desert. And the radar strip is here. And so it's an image. And the image here has just been superposed on top of an optical image. And the radar reveals all of this buried stuff that you can't see optically. So you can see all these channels. These are old fluvial channels in the Sahara Desert when the climate of the Sahara was very different, and you actually had flowing water on the surface that carved lots of channels. These images are also really good for archaeology. They've been used to find like tombs, for example, if you have very high resolution, like with an airplane. So it's very useful for seeing under things that you would otherwise just never be able to tell anything about. Another type of radar, there's a lot of similarities, but I kind of think of them as a bit different. These tend to be longer wavelength, and they're called ground penetrating radars or sounding radars. And so for this type of radar, instead of getting a picture like this that you overlay on other pictures and see buried things. You actually have a profile where this is along a track, say if you pulled a radar across the surface, or if you had an airplane that flew along here, and this is the depth. So you actually have a slice of the surface. And so in this case, you're also seeing channels, but this is a different type of thing. So this is actually from a beach area near Boston, where you've had lots of migration of fluvial channels back and forth, and then other sediments getting deposited on the top. And so at this top, you can see there's some sediments up here, but then there's this buried channel that you're seeing, which is where the water previously flowed in the beach environment, but now that channel has migrated someplace else and it's all filled in. But by pulling this radar, ground-penetrating radar across the surface, you can see all of this buried stratigraphy that you wouldn't be able to see unless you went there and dug a hole. And also this is useful because you can see the stratigraphy over a large area, as opposed to if you dug a hole, you would probably only see a small part, or you would have to excavate a ton of material. And so radar is very useful for that. And again, this is used a lot for archaeology or for even things like concrete analysis in society. So it's a pretty common technique that people use when they want to understand things that are under the surface and understand what that stratigraphy was and how things evolved through time. So those are the two different examples of radars. And at Mars, so far, we haven't sent one of these on a mission, but we've sent some of these. So this talk is going to focus on this type of example, not this, although this would be very cool on Mars, and hopefully someday we'll get there. So right now, there's 2 radars in orbit around Mars. So one of them is the Marsis radar on the Mars Express spacecraft. So this instrument is on a European Space Agency mission. And it has a really long wavelength, so about 60 plus meters. And the other one that I'm going to spend most of the time talking about is SHARAD. And that's on Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And like I said, that's the same spacecraft that the HiRISE camera is on. And the frequency of this radar is 20 megahertz, so that corresponds to about 15 meters. So these are really long wavelengths. And these are just a couple of examples of the data. So how this works is the spacecraft has this track that it flies across. And then here you can see this is Mars's data of the pole, and this is SHARAD data of one of the polar caps. And so Marsis goes down farther because you can see interfaces that are deeper than what SHARAD can see. But SHARAD is higher resolution because you can see more fine-scale layering. So those are just to give you a picture of the fact that when you change the wavelength, the image that you get out changes. So, but we're mostly going to talk about this one, which has just proved to be more interesting for some reason that we don't really understand. All right, so I'm going to show you how SHARAD works. So SHARAD, our instrument, is this line that's on the spacecraft. It's just a thin piece of metal, a metal rod. When you go to long wavelengths, you can use, this is called a dipole antenna. It's not directional, so it just radiates power in every direction. And so it's not like a satellite dish that you would think of having. It's just a line. So I can play this video. So what you're going to see with this video is that as this spacecraft tracks across the surface, the radar pings down to the surface and reflects off of tons of interfaces that are in the subsurface. So here we are flying across the surface with our dipole antenna, and then we start pulsing down into the surface, and the radar beam hits the surface and then comes back up and is recorded on the spacecraft. So here we're crossing the north polar cap of Mars, pinging away, and then we're going to open up a slice and show what that radar data looks like. And when this happens, you'll be able to see tons of subsurface interfaces, we call them, or layering. And these layers show up because every time the radar hits something that has different properties, so a different density, a different composition, you get an echo off of that too. So as the radar wave goes down, it bounces off of all of these little layers and pieces of it come back. And SHARAD doesn't see quite to the base of the polar cap everywhere, but it does, like in this example, it will see through the base. So that's sort of how the radar works, and as it goes over the surface, it collects all of these pictures of what the subsurface stratigraphy looks like. And so that's what we try and use to understand the geology of Mars and how that works with climate. So Mars' climate is really more variable than the Earth's. So there's more dramatic seasons, And that's mostly because the tilt of its axis can change a lot over time. So the Earth's axis is 23.5 degrees. But Mars, right now, it's at about 25 degrees, but it can actually vary a whole lot. So obliquity is the tilt here. So Mars goes through periods of time where the axis is nearly straight up and down, but then it also goes through periods where it's tipped over by 40 degrees. And you can see here it actually gets up to like 40, 45 degrees, and it can even go higher. And you can look at how fast this happens, and this is millions of years down here. So I mean, this is like the tilt is swinging back and forth pretty dramatically over pretty short time scales. So this means that Mars has some crazy seasons going on. So we would expect to see that in the rock record. And so this is one of the things that we'll look for. And also one of the things that could have caused Mars to be habitable sometimes and not habitable other times is this swinging around of the tilt of the orbit. Really changes the seasons on Mars a lot. And it makes some places more habitable or a better climate to have life than at other times it's just colder. Okay, so one of the first things we did with SHARAD was look at the polar caps. One of the advantages of ice to the radar is that it's really transparent. Ice can go a really long way, or radar can go a really long way through ice. So these ice caps at the poles of Mars seem like a great target for the radar. And these ice caps, so they look really different. So this is the North Polar ice cap, and this is the South Polar ice cap. This North Polar ice cap, when people try and age date it using cratering and relative stratigraphy techniques, it looks like it's only a few million years old. So it's very young, which is kind of interesting. And then the South Polar cap, when people try and date it, it's pretty old, like tens of millions of years. But remember that the obliquity swings back and forth a lot just on that less than a million-year time scale. So these polar caps could record that obliquity swinging back and forth in them. And I don't know if some of you have seen this, but we actually use Antarctic sounding to understand Earth's climate. So we go and we take core samples of Antarctica, and you can look and see volcanic eruptions layered in that ash. You can look at the isotope ratios that are there and find how the climate's changed through time. And so we kind of thought this was like an analogy that we could do on Mars, looking at the polar caps and trying to get climate information out. So this is the North Polar Cap, and it's really kind of striking that you see all these really fine layers in the polar cap. So the SHARAD team's been able to go and actually tie these layerings into the obliquity cycle of Mars. So if you go and look at some of these layers and sort of form them into packets, like you can see there's this top layer here, and then there's a gap, and then there's other packet layers. Some of these can be correlated to that climate record where when you watch the obliquity swings and you go back at the age that you expect this polar cap to be, it looks like that layering is caused by the seasonal changes on Mars, basically. And so this preserves a record of those obliquity changes. We think what happens here might be that when it's warmer, for example, you preferentially remove some of this ice and you get a lag deposit that's just the dust that was in there. Mars is very dusty, so there's always dust being deposited on here. But if you had dust in the ice and then you just sublimate or evaporate some of that ice off, then what you're left with is just this dusty layer. And so you might have these dusty layers caused by these seasonal changes basically all the way through the cap. And so we think that's what we're seeing in this case. So, but it's pretty impressive to have this, to be able to see in sort of a real way what's been going on with Mars climate. So that was one of the first things that we found. But since then, we have almost complete coverage of the poles because Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter is a pretty old mission, it's over 10 years old. So we have tracks that are really densely cover both poles. We see the poles a lot more often than the equator because we're always going over the poles with the orbit. So one of the kind of weird things that we found were these buried features in the ice cap. So like the North Polar Cap especially has these spiral troughs. You can see this weird spiraling pattern. And nobody was really sure how that formed before. But it's a key feature of this cap, and I mean, you can just look at it and it looks weird, and no one was really sure what happened, so people thought maybe there was a change in the deposition or something weird was happening. So with SHARAD, we went and looked at what these look like underground. And so here some of the spiral troughs got marked. So you can see this one, and this image are the same, but this one's marked. So you can see one here. There's kind of one here, but what we noticed were that there were some that are actually buried, like here, that aren't expressed at the surface at all. So we found buried spiral troughs. So there was this period where a bunch of spiral troughs were formed, and then for some reason they were topped over and filled in by new ice. So we can see this history of how this polar cap evolved. And further work with this has suggested that what's actually happening here is that you have these, what are called katabatic winds. So you have winds that come off the cap, and they preferentially sublimate ice off one side, and then it gets deposited onto the other side of this trough. And that over time, if you keep taking the material off one side and sort of shoveling it onto another side using winds, you end up with a spiral pattern. And so being able to find these buried ones points to times when maybe the katabatic winds weren't functioning the same way that they were today, or you had a climate shift that somehow caused a different type of deposition in the pole. But this was one of the first clues that we had that you could actually look into the polar caps and see things that were buried that we didn't have any surface expression for. So that's been pretty interesting for all of us. Another thing that we found was that there are these really big CO2 deposits at the polar caps, so at the South Polar Cap, rather. So the polar cap's mostly water ice, and people thought that there might be a little bit of CO2, maybe not very much, and there's certainly CO2 dry ice, effectively, that's deposited on the caps in the winter. So what they were surprised to find, though, is that there's actually a lot of CO2 ice on the South Polar Cap. So using the radar, because the radar wave responds to compositions differently, then the radar picked up that there was this different composition at the polar cap. And so here is a map showing some of the CO2 deposits and the thickness of these deposits. So this reservoir of CO2, it's like 30 times larger than previously thought, and it's very young. It's at the top of the layer, which means that it's young. And when people go back and again try and compare with those obliquity cycles, people think all of the CO2 would have been in the atmosphere only 600,000 years ago. And this is so much CO2 that you can actually raise the density of Mars' atmosphere by about 10 times its current density. And so that has big implications for whether or not you can have liquid water. So suddenly liquid water could be slightly more stable, although not immensely stable, it turns out. But this was very interesting for Mars climate too, because now we know that there's these deposits of CO2, and as the obliquity flips back and forth, you can release huge amounts of gas into the atmosphere, and then it can condense out in the poles once it's colder again. So that's a very different situation, and even if people thought that, sure, the polar caps go away and they come back and they go away because they're pretty young, being able to see that this is happening on pretty short timescales is sort of remarkable. Another thing that we've been able to do with the poles, we have so much data that we've actually been able to do 3D imaging. So we use some seismic techniques and software to take all of the data that we have and make a 3D image of the pole. So we actually have this box now for both poles, and that you can cut slices through and look for buried features in the ice. So there's different things that you can see. First of all, you can see the layering a lot better in this because it actually integrates all of the information that you have from all of those tracks into one image. So it's a lot clearer to look at actually than the individual radargrams or radar profiles. And one thing that we saw was a lot of buried craters. So there's all these circular features here, and a couple of little ones over here. This is one that we know about, what it is. And this one we know about too. But finding buried craters is interesting because that allows us to age date the surface better. And so the team that worked on this, Fritz Voss and some of the rest of our team, they went and looked and counted these craters and compared them to the surfaces that are around the pole. And what they find is that the surface that looks like it's underneath the ice cap has very similar craters to the population of the terrain that's surrounding it. So that suggests that, again, that the pole is pretty young, the ice is pretty young, because that surface that's underneath it is basically the same age as the surrounding surfaces. It's not like putting the ice cap there hasn't really shielded it from a lot of cratering. So the ice cap must be pretty young to be able, for that situation to actually be true. And so this has also allowed us to more date the polar ice caps than we were able to do before. Another kind of cool thing is that we can now do these fly-throughs of the polar cap. So let me see if I can get this. So we have this 3D volume, and you can actually just sort of fly through, and like pieces of the cap come and go, and you can see the layering change as you go across the pole. Some of the layering is remarkable in that it goes across almost the whole pole, and I mean that's like hundreds of kilometers, but those layers are very flat and they're very consistent across the pole. Other times you see layers kind of pinch out as you go back and forth. This is the giant hole in the data because the orbits does not go over the North Pole exactly. But it's pretty fun that, you know, you could go to Mars and you wouldn't know what's in there, you know. So, and here we have enough data that you can just fly through the pole back and forth across the image. So, and then here's, yeah, there's the sand dunes. They're really rough, so you get all these artifacts on the top. So it's been pretty fun to be able to do this and to have enough data, really. And one of the advantages of having a mission that's gone on for as long as Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter is that we actually have this data. There's always this trade-off in planetary science, like, do you want to get a new mission there, or do you want to pay for the mission that's already there? And luckily, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter gets used as a ComSat for the rovers, so nobody wants to get rid of it. In fact, they want to live for all time. So it's been great. We've gotten tons of data, but when you actually are there for a long time and keep collecting data, you can get these data sets that you really can't get unless you spend 10 years there. So it's pretty fantastic that we've been able to get this. Hopefully it'll last for a long time because it's also going to be the relay for the Mars 2020 rover. So yeah, that's it's been really fun to see this process happen and be able to fly through the polar cap. This is the South Polar Cap. So I'm not going to show the fly-through video because it takes a long time. But basically you can do the same thing. And again, we can count buried craters within and underneath this polar ice cap. Here's the CO2 deposits. Mostly I wanted to show this to show that the carbon dioxide ice looks a lot different to the radar. So there's all this layering here, which is water ice. But then the CO2 ice, there's not a lot of internal reflections from there for whatever reason. And it has different radar properties. So mapping this out was actually pretty easy. It was easy to map it out. We sat there looking at it for like 2 years, and we called these bridges because it looked kind of like there were these bridges. And we didn't know what it was, so everybody basically just was like, yeah, that's pretty unexplainable. And then one day the US PI for this was like, you know, I think it's carbon dioxide ice. And then when you know that that's true, then it's really easy to figure out from the radar data that that's actually what it is. So it's kind of sad that, I feel like it's kind of sad that it took us so long to figure it out, but that's often the case in science, I guess. So yeah, that's some of our data for the polar caps. I think that's been one of the most cool things about SHARAD is being able to see all that layering in the ice and go back and look at the climate record and see the buried craters and all the layering that happens inside the ice caps. It's not the only thing we've been able to do with SHARAD, though. SHARAD's also discovered mid-latitude ice, like a lot of ice that we didn't know was there. And this ice is perhaps more interesting for the exploration side because the poles are really hard environments to get to. There's a lot of seasonal deposition of ice. So, for example, we sent one spacecraft near the poles, and we now have a picture of it under the ice, partially, during the winter. So it's been basically crushed by the ice that's deposited every year and then sublimated off. So if you're going to send astronauts or long-term surface rovers or something, then you want to go to mid or low latitudes. And so this work that I'm showing here is by Allie Bramson. She's a graduate student here in the department. And she's worked a lot with the SHARAD team. She's part of our team now. So what she noticed was that this is another profile, and it's over the mid-latitudes of Mars, so like 50 degrees. And this is a really extensive deposit. And she also noticed that it corresponded to these kind of weird craters. And this is a crater digital terrain model from the HiRISE camera. So there's different layers. And there's this floor terrace, and then it ramps up, and then there's this wall terrace up here. And so these kind of odd craters, people think that their morphology occurs because you have a subsurface ice layer. And so when you have an impact into that layer, it creates this weird shape where you kind of have a double wall. So there's some evidence that there is ice there. And so what Allie did was take the profiles of these craters and match the depths here and look at the depth here. And she was able to demonstrate that the most likely scenario is that this is an ice-rich layer on the surface, and that why you're seeing this interface here is because there's an ice-rich layer on top of probably lava flows or basalt and what the normal Mars surface composition. And so then after that, she can actually map out that whole region and see how extensive is that region that we think is ice. And it's actually pretty extensive. So this is a map of Mars, longitude and latitude. And this is the region where she sees that reflector, which is a pretty big area. I mean, you can see it extends over, 15 degrees of latitude, or longitude rather. And then other people have found other ones. So Cassie Sturman, who's at Texas, found another one that's in a different part of mid-latitudes. But you'll notice, again, it's high 40s to 50 degrees, the same as this. So these are on those northern plains of Mars. And so the radars turned up these deposits that are ice sheets. And so now both of these locations are places where people are thinking about sending future robotic missions, or even SpaceX is really interested because they want to have a colony on Mars. And of course, if you're going to do that, then you need a source of water and a source of ice. And so this is a place where we think there's pretty near surface ice that you could go and dig up and excavate and mine. NASA's interested in this too. I think they're hoping that we'll find evidence of ice at even lower latitudes because it's just easier. Everything is easier with the seasons and the temperature when you go to even lower latitudes than the mid-40s. But SpaceX is kind of like, whatever, this is good enough for us. So they're looking into some of these areas and trying to see if there's regions within those areas that would be even better to go than others. So it's kind of changed how people think about where they would want to go on Mars, especially if you were going to be someplace for a long time. I think the idea for the mining of the ice in these places would be that you scrape off the surface and then try and sublimate the ice off and then catch it with some sort of thing. Another idea that NASA's thought of is maybe you could just dispense with the ice entirely and go someplace where you have clay minerals or hydrated minerals where you might have water trapped inside the crystal matrix, and then try and liberate it that way. And there's people at Johnson Space Center working on that. But really, it seems like the easiest thing to do is just go someplace where you know that there's water that you can just get to right away. So these are a couple of the examples of mid-latitude ice that we've found. And then what I've been working on is actually volcanoes. Ice is great, but what I'm really interested in is volcanism. And one of the reasons I'm interested in it is because we now know that on the Earth, volcanism was a major component of mass extinctions on the Earth. So you have these places like the Columbia flood basalts in the US where you had enormous amounts of volcanism that probably affected our climate. And there's also the Deccan Troughs in India, and there's these big volcanic deposits in Siberia. And the ones in Siberia, people think were responsible for one of the mass extinctions on Earth because you have so much volcanism going on that actually changed our climate. And one of the questions for Mars, because we know there's many volcanoes on Mars, there's many big volcanoes on Mars, and volcanoes could have been active like 1 billion years ago. So the question was, could those volcanoes have produced periods that were clement enough that life could have retaken a foothold or possibly taken a foothold? And what were the effects of volcanism on habitability on Mars? And even in general, what are the implications of having a lot of active volcanism to habitability of worlds? So what I've been doing is mostly focusing on volcanoes. So one of the weird features on Mars is this Medusa Fossae formation. And basically, it's a series of hills in the mid-latitudes of Mars. So this is 0 degrees latitude. And then this is longitude, so it covers a really huge area. And so there's all these hills, Gordy Dorsum, Amazonas Mensa. They have very sort of poetic names, and they all have these this linear look to them. And they have kind of a weird texture, and because they're essentially these mountains, no one really knows what to make of them. This is what the surface looks like. So it's wind eroded. There's like these dunes, streaks down the side. There's occasionally boulders and little layers. Here's another example. And you can see there's some blocky debris fell out, and there's some streaks coming down. There's really fine layers here. So it's this really weird rock. And so people didn't really understand what it was. Basically, people now think that this is a giant set of pyroclastic deposits. So pyroclastics are things like ash or tephra that get deposited during explosive volcanic eruptions. And so Medusa Fossae is probably a buildup of a lot of this material that either was launched into the atmosphere and then fell down over time as it was blown by the wind, or possibly even some of it could be flows. If any of you have seen explosive volcanoes, people are always really worried that there'll be this big pyroclastic flow that's going to come down and like run over towns and things like that. That definitely happens on Mars too. And so some of these deposits could be some of those different things. So the question that we had was, how much material is really here, and over what period did this happen? So if you have this explosive volcanism, you're throwing a lot of gas into the atmosphere. Maybe that's a case where you could have increased the density of the atmosphere, or have it a more habitable environment. So when we look at this with SHARAD, so this is looking at the Gordy Dorsum and this Amazonas Mensa hill in particular. We see really strong reflectors from underneath. And we also see some evidence of subsurface topography. So there's like a little hill here. So we've been able to measure the thickness of this deposit. And one of the things that we're interested in doing is trying to see what this topography is buried underneath these hills. We can't do 3D imaging of this yet because we don't have enough data like at the poles, but that's what we're trying to go for and be able to sort of reconstruct the subsurface structure of these hills and see if that will tell us anything about how they formed. We actually used Marsis to look over this too. So this is the one that's the long wavelength radar. And this is the same area. So this is Amazonas Mensa again. And it sees the reflector that SHARAD sees, but it also sees another set of reflectors that are even underneath that. So using the radar data, we've been able to see that there were these episodes of volcanism that are buried underneath the volcanism that we can see. So we have these stacked layers, and the character of these layers suggests that it's all pyroclastic deposits. So you had these stacked pyroclastic deposits with probably some era where there was some erosion or something to create this middle layer. And so we thought these were big hills to begin with, but it looks like there's even a lot more of that material than what we thought. And on Mars, it's actually easier to get pyroclastic volcanism and ash deposits because the low pressure lets the gas dissolve more easily than on the Earth. So you can basically get explosive eruptions much more easily than you can on the Earth. So there should be a lot of pyroclastic material. But this is still bigger than any pyroclastic or volcanic deposit that we have on the Earth. So, and it probably was not all created in one volcanic eruption. But there are a number of big volcanoes on Mars. So we're just not sure which ones it came from. So like I said, what we're trying to do now is get enough data to be able to reconstruct the history of that region in a 3D way, like what we can do with the polar caps. But we don't have quite enough data for that yet. All right, so then I wanted to spend just a few more minutes at the end of the talk talking about the future of radars, and particularly the Mars 2020 mission, which is going to have a radar on it. So Mars 2020, this is a little picture of it here, is a rover that NASA is going to launch in 2020, and then it will arrive in February 2021. And the main purpose of this radar, or this rover, is to do sampling. So the goal is to send it someplace that's really old, to find a habitable environment, and to look for biosignatures. So it's got a sampling arm on it. It'll actually drill cores. And the goal is that it will collect all these cores, and then it's going to put them on the ground, and then we're going to send another spacecraft, which is going to pick them all up, and then we're going to bring them back to the Earth. So this is like step one in Mars sample return. None of the other steps have been planned other than this step where you get the cores and put them on the surface. So we're not entirely sure what's going to happen besides that part. But the radar will be very capable. It'll be a lot different. Even though the base of it looks like the Curiosity rover, the instruments that are on it are a lot different because the assumption here was that we're going to bring the samples back to Earth. So we don't need to do the sort of chemistry set analysis that the Curiosity rover does. So they're mostly remote sensing instruments. And the most important job for these instruments on the rover is going to be to characterize the environment. Because whenever you take samples and you want to analyze them in a lab, it's very important to know where they came from and what that surrounding environment was and the geologic context of them. And so these instruments were really selected to develop that context. And so the RIMFAX radar is on the back. And so we were selected to look at the subsurface in this profiling mode. RIMFAX will have higher resolution than SHARAD and Marsis. And it'll be more like the systems that people use for archaeology on the Earth that you pull by hand. And except this one will be remotely operated on a rover. And so then whenever the rover is driving, we're pinging the surface like this. And then it's the same thing where whenever the radar wave hits an interface in the stratigraphy, we'll see an echo back from it. So then we'll be able to, as the rover's going along, see what's underneath the surface. And a major reason why people wanted to have a radar on this was because they realized with the other rovers that they had this problem where they would see a unit and it looked really exciting. And so they would be sampling it or looking at it or whatever. Then they would drive off and they often had no idea how that unit connected to what they went to next because Mars is very dusty. Units can be dipping. Maybe you don't see where that unit went. And so what they're hoping is that with this system, we will be able to track those units so that if you sample one unit or look at one unit, then you drive off, you can see that, oh, it went under this, or like, oh, it's part of this other piece of the stratigraphy, which is context that we didn't have before ever. RIMFAX, I think now will be the first GPR on Mars. So the Europeans are going to send an instrument as well. But now it looks like they've been delayed so long that we might actually arrive first. Not that it's a competition. And actually, like our principal investigator, he's Norwegian, Sven-Erik Hamran. And this radar is being provided by the Norwegian Defense Research Agency. But he was actually on the other one too, and now he's happy he won this one in the competition because it's probably going to get there first. But he's associated with both of them, so it's lucky for him. So this is the frequency that we're operating at, 150 megahertz to 1.2 gigahertz. Basically, the wavelength's a lot shorter, so we have higher resolution, but we don't see down quite as far. Like this radar would not see to the base of the polar cap, but we don't have to. We're only interested in what the rover is driving over. So we'll penetrate maybe 10 to 100 meters, and we kind of expect most places will penetrate maybe 20 meters or something, not that far. And we have 5 to 10 centimeter vertical resolution, so we'll be able to see things at pretty fine layers. Here's some of the other instruments. I don't really want to go through them all in detail, but we've got like a camera, Mastcam Z. So this is going to be the same camera that's on Curiosity, except we'll have a zoom mode. So it'll be like the camera that you have where you can click the little zoom and it'll go, and you can zoom in on things. So that'll be pretty interesting. We have some wind sensors and atmospheric measurements. We have a couple of different spectroscopy options. So SuperCam will do laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. So if you're a fan of Curiosity, it's got a laser and it shoots stuff with a laser, and then it measures the spectral signature. So we have a laser too, not to be outdone. We have a microscopic imager. So, and we have like Pixel will look at its X-ray diffraction. So we have a lot of different tools that will be able to look at rocks. And so what we're going to be looking for is, first of all, environments that look like they were habitable. So do we see stream beds? Does it look like there was water in this place for a long time? And then also what minerals are there? What things look like they could be interesting to sample? And we have a lot of people on our team who study very early Earth life. And so those people have a very good idea about what types of rocks and what types of minerals you would want to sample that could tell you whether or not there were ever organisms there. So the Norwegians like to test their equipment on Svalbard, this little Norwegian island. And so here's an example of our antenna. This is what our antenna actually looks like. And they drove it over a glacier on these snowmobiles, an option that we don't have on Mars. And you can see the base of the glacier, basically. So we're at the point where we're building equipment now, which is pretty exciting. And at JPL, they've got the descent ring and some of the actual body of the spacecraft built in their high bay. So it's pretty exciting that we actually have real equipment now. So where is this thing going? Well, whenever we want to send a rover somewhere on Mars, a process has been established. And in this process, the scientific community looks around Mars, they find places they think are interesting, And then we have a landing site workshop where everyone gets to fairly present what it is that their idea is for where to go. So there was a number of these landing site workshops, and then people vote. So, and then people get voted off, and then that's the end of those sites. So it's like reality television, except it's with scientists. So it's pretty hilarious sometimes. And so the ones that were sort of voted the highest in the last landing site are these two over by Isidis Basin, Jezero Crater and Northeast Syrtis. These other ones, Eberswald Crater and Marth Vallis, also scored pretty well. But what came out of the landing site workshop was that they also have a committee of people who meets at the end. And they basically decided that for engineering reasons, they wanted to narrow this down very quickly because it's hard to build a rover if you don't know what site you're going to. So these kind of got scratched off, and now we're left with these two. And a possible third one of the Spirit landing site, but I don't think we're going back there. So I think it's these two that we're going to be going to, one or the other. And the thing about these two that people like is that there's carbonates there. So these are some of the only places on Mars where we know that there's carbonates. And there's also very old rocks. So if we go to one of these sites, we'll have access to the oldest rocks that we've ever seen from a Mars mission. So that would be pretty exciting. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about where these are. So this is Jezero Crater. So one of the landing sites is in here. Never mind all of this, I just wanted to show the context. And Northeast Syrtis is up here. So they're very close to each other. So in a way, we'll be sampling the same types of rocks. But the landing sites are sort of different. So Northeast Syrtis is this beautiful, like almost Monument Valley mesas, except not that big, really. Here's a diagram of one of the mesas. So this is 5 meters by 100 meters. And so the ability to even land amid all this terrain is being made possible by the fact that JPL has developed a new landing system, which will be more precise. So it's sort of this incredible terrain, and what we would want to do here is sample these olivine carbonates. So on Earth, carbonates are often associated with life. Here, we think these carbonates may have been formed and associated with volcanics, so they might not be biological. In fact, the going assumption is that they're not. But it's definitely interesting, and it's something that's new and that we don't really have any evidence for. All of these rocks are really old, so they're from the time period when the valley networks were forming. So it's a time in Mars history that we've never sent anything that's someplace that's this old before. One of the things about the Northeast Syrtis site is that people think it's a good place to look because you've shaved off these mesas to look at hydrothermal systems, because it looks like those carbonates may have been formed through water interaction in rock. So it might have been a situation like this at one time. And this is a picture that National Geographic made for this site in particular, that this is the picture that people sort of have for what it could have been like. So it looks totally different than this now, but that was billions of years ago. Another thing that I think is really interesting that I hadn't thought about before I started working on this is this Megaberetta, the possibilities of these Megaberetta. So when you have impacts, they throw out huge blocks of material. And these are some of the blocks. So this is a 100-meter scale bar. And these are giant rocks that have been thrown out by an impact. And you can see tons of layering in these rocks, too. And we think these were thrown out by very large impact craters that could have excavated things from really below the surface. And so these rocks, probably things that were from originally below the surface and have been chucked out onto the surface. So we can also visit this site and look at these rocks, possibly even older than some of the other rocks that we knew were there. But of course, we don't have them in stratigraphy. They're just like rocks that were thrown onto the surface and have become part of the terrain. So then the other place is Jezero Crater. So Jezero Crater, the thing that people like about it is that, unlike at Northeast Syrtis, there's a clear story for there being liquid water here. So this is an open basin lake where water once filled this crater and then ran out the other side. So we know there's water in here because we can see an outlet channel. So water filled in here and then it ran out. And it deposited this delta. So there was standing water here. We don't know there was standing water at the other site. We just know that there's really old rocks and that they're very interesting rocks, and they're all in stratigraphy. Here, we wouldn't have access to that stratigraphy all laid out in those beautiful mesas. Instead, what we would be doing is looking at rocks that got eroded from up here and were carried down this river channel and deposited into this basin. But what we would have is a lake. So if you want to look for biological materials, perhaps the lake is the place to go. The delta is really pretty. This is the delta. It's been partially eroded. You can see the channel came down here, and it's got all of these patterns that you see just in deltas on Earth, too. this color image shows where some of the different composition materials are. So the red is basalt, so it's just volcanic rock, and then the green is clays, and then the blue is carbonates. So there's different materials, and we think we could drive up onto the delta. So engineers have been working using 3D models, and they think you can actually drive up onto the delta. And then we asked them, like, can you drive like up here, and then like up here, and then drive out of the crater? And then we could just go to both landing sites at the same time. And they were like, we'll get back to you on that. So I don't know if that's going to be possible. Probably not, although people have talked about it. And one of the advantages to the northeast Sirtis site, of course, is that you can keep going, whereas if you go to this site, you're stuck in this crater. Most likely, maybe they can find a way out, but probably not. The rover, uses nuclear power again, just like Curiosity. And the problem with those rovers is that there's a limited time frame for that to work. So solar panels, we've been really lucky with Spirit and Opportunity went forever, and it's because the solar panels kept getting dusted off by windstorms. So, the solar panels just kept going and going and going, and the rovers just kept going until they would finally break down. But these rovers, using the RTGs, there's a finite time to that energy source, and when it's gone, then the mission is over. So they probably won't last for like 10 years. So we don't have an unlimited amount of time to traverse around places. And also this mission will be pretty focused on sampling, because that's the big goal. So that's the next radar that's going to Mars. Another thing that will be fun to do is use this imaging radar instead. And this is an image that's taken from the Arecibo radar in Puerto Rico. I've been thinking a lot about Puerto Rico recently for obvious reasons, but this is an image that was taken using the radar system there. And you can see all these lava flows. So these are the Tharsis volcanoes. This is Olympus Mons up here. And these are all lava flows, and they don't look like this visually. Mars doesn't look like this visually because you're seeing into the subsurface here. You're seeing through that dust layer. You can just see a lot more detail. So this would be a really useful tool for Mars as well. And it's something that people are thinking about for future missions, but no one's really done it yet. Okay, and so there's a lot of other possibilities that you could do too. And hopefully RIMFAX is the beginning of being able to just use ground-penetrating radar as a remote sensing tool in the way that people use it on Earth, so that it's not a strange thing to put a radar on an object. They're pretty low mass and also low power for these ones that you would put on rovers. And so I have some friends at NASA who are investigating how astronauts could use it, for example, to look for hiding places, or even just to see terrain that they're going to drill through. So I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I think radar will be a more common tool. It was only invented in the 60s, and I think to some extent people are still trying to understand how to use it and what the best ways to use it are. And so I think in the future it will be even more useful. So anyway, that's my story about SHARAD and all of the Mars radars, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah, Chris. Oh, yeah, he brought the.
Well, just before I take the question, I wanted to say thank you very much. Fantastic presentation, really interesting. And also that we're very excited to have Lynn here. So as I mentioned originally, she'd been at Goddard, but she has now been here as a new member of our faculty for almost 1 year. And so really wonderful to have you here. And so I think you were first for a question.
Thanks, that was great, I enjoyed it. The mid-latitude ice you were looking at, how deep do we think that is under the surface? How deep do you have to dig to go get it?
Meters. So yeah, a couple meters.
A couple, not 20.
Not probably 20. Yeah. I think we're still a little bit uncertain because SHARAD can't tell us that much actually about the very upper part of the surface. So it's more just from looking at little craters and like other sources of evidence that we think that. It actually still seems like a daunting amount of material to people, because how do you really remove that much overburden, even if it's a couple meters? It's like a lot, but.
Another question?
So what reason does this Mars rover not use solar panels?
I think that they just, the nuclear power is just, it's smaller and more compact and reliable, and for this mission in particular, they're basically just copying Curiosity as well. So, and it would also be important if you went to areas that were where you had to survive the winter longer, because then it provides more heat and stuff, which originally we were thinking of some landing sites that would be farther to the south and farther away from the equator. But those ended up getting voted off, so we didn't need them. So.
Thank you.
Is there a plan to combine data from RIMFAX and, say, SHARAD, like to observe the same area?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually what I'm doing right now for my research, is basically looking at Jezero Crater and trying to see if we see anything. Jezero Crater is really small, so you know, we haven't seen any subsurface interfaces, so it's kind of disappointing that there's nothing there. But we did look, and the hope is definitely to use RIMFAX, you know, at least to understand the site types of layering that you have, and then maybe we can use that to help interpret SHARAD other places where we see layering.
In response to his question, you said that the liquid deposits are only a few meters below the surface. How deep are these deposits? You know,
Yeah, so I'm trying to
Yeah.
remember what that was.
what
Tens
is
of
the depth
meters.
of the deposits? I mean, like, you know, 100 meters down, or
The thickness of the deposit once you
Yes.
get through that overburden layer. Yeah, it's too bad Allie's not here because she would know the answer to this off the top of her head. This is her thesis. But yeah, I think it's tens of meters. Yeah.
okay.
Just out of curiosity, how wide a swath can SHARAD do per pass per orbit?
Yep, that's a good question. So it's about 1 kilometer wide, which is actually kind of bad because, you know, we would like to have it narrower so that we can distinguish where the echoes are coming from. It's actually a long track, it's better. We get hundreds of meters. But because the wavelength is so long and it's a dipole, we just see stuff coming back from pretty far away.
What is it that makes the radio wave called radar? Because it looks like 15 megahertz is ultrasound to some people,
Oh,
diagnosis, is shortwave to other people,
yeah.
and yet you're using it as a bouncing radar. What is it that radar is in terms of the use of a radio wave?
So I guess like ultrasound, that's sound waves in the air. So that's compressing the air. But light is, you know, it's like the same as visible light. It's just really long wavelengths. So it's not the same as ultrasound and things like that. You know, ultrasound doesn't travel through a vacuum because you can't compress anything in a vacuum, but light will still travel through a vacuum. And in terms of whether you consider it long wavelength or short wavelength or whatever, yeah, there's a lot of disagreement between people about what constitutes long and short wavelengths. So I've had people refer to some of my instruments as microwave instruments. Some people refer to them as radio. And I mean, there are spectral bands, so you can look at the bands, and some of them are called millimeter or, you know, whatever, but people use it informally, just they say anything, pretty much. I mean, once you get past a certain boundary region between the two of them, they're pretty fixed on a certain frequency range. But yeah, definitely I've heard a lot of confusion about the difference between microwaves and radio waves, and what are long radio waves and what are short wave radio waves and things like that.
You had a slide that had a number of Australian-looking names. I was just curious how they get named, or who did that.
So names on Mars have to be approved by the International Astronomical Union. That's who approves all the names for everything. So I think it might be a coincidence that they all seemed Australian. Anyone can submit names. I mean, people here have submitted names for things, for craters, for other features. And you have to follow the naming convention of that planet. So, you know, like different planets have different naming features. Venus, typically women, you have to name them after women from different cultures. And so Mars has its own naming scheme, which goes down, you know, from like big features to small features. And the level of impressive naming that you need sort of goes down as you go to smaller and smaller features. So yeah, I don't know offhand where all those came from, but it's a complicated process that has to get approved by someone.
This may not be directly related to your research, but is there any particular reason that among the instruments that you bring into Mars, microphone is not included as part
A
of
microphone?
it? Yes, like capturing sound recording.
I think we actually have a microphone now, or at least there was a plan to have one on Mars 2020. Yeah.
Mars 2020 is the first one that's supposed to have the microphone so we can hear it a little bit.
Yeah. One of the things that, so we have this drill, right, which is a percussive drill. So the best way to drill in that atmosphere and with the rock types is to not just drill, but to like percussively drill. And so they put it in a Mars chamber and like listened to it with a microphone so that you could hear the drilling. And sure enough, when you go to the low density air, the drilling sounds a lot different. So at our team meeting, they were playing what the drilling sounds like on Earth in their lab, and then what the drilling sounds like at Mars atmosphere pressure. So it was a lot different. So it was pretty weird. So hopefully we'll be able to hear it on Mars actually. Oh, so there's a microphone there.
How long did the planning and research and all of that take before SHARAD was sent out?
It took a long time. So I'm trying to remember when Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter was first approved, but I know it was, I think it was when I was like starting grad school or something, and then I worked on it as a postdoc, and that was 2005. So that's when it arrived at Mars. So it's a long time. Normally for a lot of these, it takes like 5 to 10 years to get missions sent. And that's, you may even do development work on the instruments even prior to that. So in some cases, it's like 20 years of people's lives where they go through stages of instrument development, and then they propose, and then they might lose, and then they propose again. And then it's still like a few years to get it together. So, yes.
Are any of the instrumentation on Mars 2020 supplied by the U of A?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. There's a lot from JPL. There's one from Norway. The atmospheric science package is from Spain, so that's our other international collaboration. I'm trying to remember who else. Oh, Los Alamos. They're the ones doing the laser LIBS spectroscopy.
So I have two questions. The first one is, you had mentioned the 2020 rover is going to take core samples and leave them for a future pickup. Since you're looking for biology, what's the time frame that those core samples will lay on the surface and the risk that the composition changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's like a major concern of our team, and definitely a major concern of everyone who would be studying those samples in the laboratory. We actually have no idea when people might come and get them. The plan for Mars science is really in turmoil. There's been not a coherent plan by the new administration, so no one basically knows what the plan is. So people try and plan, to the best of their ability with no knowledge of what's going to happen. So our plan is sort of now that they wanted to make, so that they have tubes, so we're at least sealing them. We're sealing them in a tube. And then the problem is that they might get hot sitting in the sun. So we're going to try and find a place that's shady, or like, someplace where we think there's a little bit of protection for these tubes. How we're going to find that place, or what that would look like, is something that we don't know and that people are still looking into. And I suspect as soon as we choose a landing site, one of the things is going to be to look for where you want to put them. Like, do you want to put them against a wall? And I think finding safer places for them is going to be a major focus of the mission. So we'd like to do a lot of remote sensing science, and obviously with RIMFAX, we want to keep drive as long as possible, everywhere, to get data. But I think a lot of it's going to be focused on trying to keep the samples safe and picking the correct samples. It's also a problem that if we go there and we don't pick up any samples that people find interesting, then we're probably not going back there, because we're not going to design a whole sample return program for something if we don't think there's anything interesting in those things that we sampled. So there's a lot of pressure to get that part right. But yeah, that's a concern, and I think people, they kind of know the answer, but they can't quantify the answer without any information about the landing site or what the plan is to come and get them.
Can this radar detect any characteristics or types of carbon material that would sustain life besides just surface qualities?
So I think what they're going to look for is geochemical evidence that indicates that things could have been biologically processed. combined with some evidence that there was liquid or standing water, since we think water is so important to life. So I think those are the two kind of chemical things that they'll be looking for. So ratios of minerals in chemistry that could indicate that something was processed by life, and also just evidence of water in the rock types. Was there one?
This is sort of a offshoot. Is there any talk about involving private industry in, you know, like reaching out to, you know, Elon Musk with his, you know, sending, you know, what is it, catches of supplies and stuff?
Yeah, so we did joke that he would bring the samples back. That
works.
So I mean, there's no reason why somebody else couldn't build the spacecraft and go and get the samples. But yeah, I mean, we have actually talked with them a lot, and especially like Red Dragon, and you know, if people are going to start sending things to Mars on a regular basis, even if it's not NASA, it's fine. You know, we're happy to supply instruments for them. So we've talked about working with them to have a radar so that you could see subsurface ice, and the U of A is interested in providing cameras for them for those missions. And so that's a conversation that we've definitely had with private industry a lot.
Yeah, with the current administration, private industry will get there first.
Yeah, so that was, hence the joke. But yeah, I mean, they might actually do it, so.
Okay, are we done?
Thank you all.